Today we're covering Howard Zinn's Legacy of Communist Indoctrination, an article from the Unschool Substack, which you should definitely go and check out. The crux of this article is about Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, and how it promotes a biased and distorted view of American history. Actually, right off the bat, right from page 1, we get quite a lot of bias in this book. You can see in this quotation that many people have read in the past that it's heavily edited. Zinn tends to use these ellipses as a way to edit out anything that might make Columbus look good. And these ellipses sometimes represent multiple pages in Columbus's journals, something a lot of people are not fully aware of. The purpose of this first paragraph and this first page of this book, first 4 or 5 really, is to make it look like Columbus's original intent was to find someone to enslave, but that really just wasn't the case. If you actually read Columbus's original journals, he talks about how the natives were stout, good-looking, even ingenious, but of course Zinn, who is a lifelong communist, is not going to include that sort of information in his rewriting of American history. So in the article you see it says, their spears are made of cane, they would make fine servants. With 50 men we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. Well, part of that is actually in reference to an opposing island, because Columbus had met and befriended the Arawak people, and the Arawak people had informed him that the neighboring Carib people were not quite as nice. And they showed him their scars on their bodies and said that they had to fight them quite often, which is pretty unfortunate. And there was also claims that they were quite possibly cannibals. So that's pretty scary. But Zinn didn't want to mention that sort of thing, right? His objective was to make Columbus look poorly. So here we have another article from Syracuse.com. It says, as I discovered in writing debunking Howard Zinn, Zinn plagiarized most of his first 5.5 pages of his book. Okay, so that plagiarized the first 5.5 pages. Furthermore, the source that Zinn plagiarized is not a book on history, but a polemic written for high school students by a novelist and fellow anti-Vietnam War activist Hans Koning. The ellipses in the above passage, which I showed you earlier, leaves out 2 days' worth of entries, entire pages, and critical information from Columbus's logs. One sentence Zinn leaves out is this one: I know that they are a people who can be made free and converted to our holy faith more by love than by force. Of course, a Marxist and communist like Zinn is not going to include that sort of information because it doesn't fit his narrative. This and many similar statements show the devout Catholic Columbus's concern for the natives. Furthermore, Zinn did not indicate that the subject doing the subjecting, wait, did I read that right? Did not indicate that the subject doing the subjugating and who thinks of the Arawaks as making fine servants, they left out of Ka Kijon's quotation, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, are members of an enemy tribe and not Columbus. Indeed, they bear the scars of such efforts, like I said earlier. Here's another article from the City Journal, which talks a little bit about FBI documents proving that, Zinn was actually a communist. It shouldn't really be surprising. He spoke at communist meetings. I'm going to show a clip a little bit later, which shows that Zinn is actually pretty smart, has a pretty good sense of humor, right? As many intelligent people often do, they are pretty funny. And Zinn's a very smart guy, and he used his intelligence to do nefarious things, I think. And, creates quite a lot of propaganda through his book, A People's History of the United States. This is kind of off topic, but it kind of ruined that movie starring Matt Damon, which talks about that book as well. What's it called? Let's look it up right now. Good Will Hunting, right? Like I like that movie overall. It's a pretty high quality movie, but it kind of ruins it for me after reading Howard Zinn's A People's History and finding out that the so-called genius of the movie read a book that is so easily refuted. But anyways, back to what we were saying. This paragraph here says, but amid charges, innocuous and affirmous, are specific allegations by numerous eyewitnesses that Howard Zinn was indeed a Communist Party member. After interviewing Zinn on November 6, 1953, and again on February 9, 1954, FBI agents described him as a courteous and friendly, yet willing to part with information only after a repetition of pointed questions. Zinn admitted membership in numerous communist fronts, and this is really the key part, because if you don't like the FBI, and the FBI certainly has its history of issues, this part here is hard to refute. He's a member of the American communist fronts like the Americans Veterans Committee and the American Labor Party, which employed Zinn at its headquarters in Brooklyn at a time when communists controlled it. But he steadfastly denied membership in the Communist Party itself. Several communist members said otherwise. The files paraphrase one informant's conversation with Zinn in 1948 as the future historian traveled from a protest outside the Truman White House to a Brooklyn rally for a presidential candidate, Henry Wallace. According to the informant, Zinn indicated that he is a member of the Communist Party and that he attends party meetings 5 nights a week in Brooklyn. That seems like a little much. The files summarize how another informant believed that Zinn was selected as a delegate to the New York State Communist Party convention. Okay, and this is all from the City Journal, so you can look up this article yourself and read the rest. I don't want to get dinged for copyright infringement, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. But just keep in mind that the evidence is pretty conclusive that Zinn is a member of the Communist Party, or was when he was alive. Okay, so this article from Unschool is largely based on Mary Graber's book, Debunking Howard Zinn, Exposing the Fake History That Turned a Generation Against America. And in that book, she talks about how, the objective was to inspire anger of such magnitude that its readers want to overthrow the American Republic. And in this Unschool article, it talks about how they needed a new narrative. Another book came out a few years earlier called Gulag Archipelago, and some of you have probably read that before, but its objective partially was to destroy the Marxist narrative and to let people know that the Soviets killed tons of people. Vladimir Lenin was no savior. He started the gulags in Russia and killed 4 million people himself, and then Stalin went and he made them even worse, killed at least another 20 million people, probably more, in the gulags as well. Many people nowadays are well aware of the fact that he killed about 6 million kulaks, basically by starving them to death, right? And that's a sort of typical Marxist things that happen with socialist and with fascist countries. They are collectivist groups that say that if you don't fit into our group, you don't get to exist anymore. There's nothing in the Marxist narrative that says people have intrinsic value. There's just nothing there. That comes from, many religious people hold those truths to be self-evident, and humanists as well believe in the intrinsic value of human beings. Buddhists believe that all living things have value, not just people, but everything that's alive has some degree of value. There's nothing like that in socialism or communism or fascism. It's collectivism. You need to be part of the group, right? But there's always exceptions to the rule. There's always people who don't want to be part of the group. So what happens to them? Well, we saw in the 20th century that most of them end up getting killed. And by the time Gulag Archipelago came out, the narrative was overwhelming. You couldn't change, what had happened. There was nothing left. So intellectuals had realized that many of these socialist countries had ended up failing miserably, but they still had held out some hope for Lenin and for the Soviet Union, right? They started to change their tune later on when, you just couldn't prove it wrong anymore. There's just too much overwhelming evidence of the socialists had killed more than 100 million people in, around 50 years or so. So they needed a new narrative because they still wanted people to believe in their ideology. And, academics and intellectuals are all about ideology. A lot of the times ideological purity, unfortunately, and so they needed a new narrative, and Howard Zinn was there to help them out, to paint America, to paint the United States as something that was built out of racism and white supremacy, and that just wasn't the case at all. Okay, so in this article it says Howard Zinn's interpretation of the American Revolution in his book, A People's History, was biased to say the least. Zinn viewed the American Revolution as a conflict between elites who wanted independence from Britain only to preserve their own power and wealth, and the broader masses of the American people who were seeking greater freedom and equality. Suffice to say, he did not believe the Founding Fathers had any real interest in advocating for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or if you're me, pursuit of being fairly content. This analysis alludes to his efforts to analyze American history through a Marxist lens, right? Marxists believe that history is a class struggle. They believe in the materialist version of history, which is kind of a racist worldview, but with extra steps. Karl Marx himself was quite racist towards a number of different groups because his Marxist, his materialist worldview is one that says that basically, if you're a generation behind in economic development, it negatively affects the quality of the thoughts that can come to your mind. Not fully, but to some extent. So he believed that some of these groups were just going to sort of fade away over time. I don't think that he was genocidal at all. He just thought that these groups would just disappear. But he was quite racist towards Slavs, which is partially my ancestry. Slav is also where the word slave comes from. But he's also quite racist towards Africans, towards natives, towards Jewish people. Obviously, one of his first books on the Jewish question, you could find that book for free online and skim through it, and it's one of the most racist things you'll probably ever read. Maybe the most racist thing that you'll ever read, because in the modern era, no one would ever really be able to get that sort of thing published because it's just really, really racist. But anyways, Zinn believed the revolution needed to be diminished to a simple conflict between classes to convince young Americans that our country's founding principles were based on a lie. This is not only dangerous, but completely false. It is time to reject this biased perspective. Okay? Because we need a more balanced worldview. I'm not saying that we have to go full on, nationalist or patriotic, but we certainly need a more balanced version of history. Okay? Another major problem with this book is numerous factual errors. If you read the book and you've read much history besides that book, and unfortunately I don't think a lot of college students have. It's like this is the only history book they read. But it's not so common for a history book to have zero sources like A People's History does. And he actually eventually published some sources, but separate from the actual book, because he knows that he was just making things up. So he doesn't want to publish them together. But it's also not common to have ellipses like we showed you earlier. But that's a problem throughout the book. There's tons of sentences that are just cut off halfway through. And then you see an ellipses, and then another half of another sentence. And the effort there is to create a incredibly biased narrative, to present a version of what someone is saying that just isn't the case. Okay? So here it says, Zinn claims that Columbus was aware the Earth was round, while in reality, Columbus believed the Earth was pear-shaped. That's a hard one to understand, but it's interesting how that continuously changes, whether Columbus believed the Earth was flat, round, or pear-shaped. I'll leave that argument to somebody else. But Zinn also claims that the American Revolution was primarily a class struggle, while in reality it was primarily a struggle for political rights and representation. People know that Americans were unhappy about getting taxed without representation. Zinn also, and another major factor as well was, I just said it, I guess. Yeah, no representation at all. But anyways, Zinn also asserts that the American Revolution did not bring about any significant change for enslaved African populations, while in reality, the revolution led to the abolition of slavery in some northern states. Zinn also asserts that the American Revolution did not bring about any significant changes for women, while in reality the revolution led to the expansion of women's rights and opportunities. Okay, I mean, the revolution started a trend around the whole world. A few years later, Haiti, a predominantly Catholic country, would be the first in the Western Hemisphere to end slavery, and that would also continue a lot of changes throughout Europe. France would outlaw slavery a year after Haiti, and then other countries would follow suit. A couple years later, the British Empire would start the blockade of Africa and start hanging slave traders, which is kind of cool. But unfortunately, in the U.S., it did take us a while. Even though we ended the slave trade in the early 1800s, we wouldn't end slavery within the country until decades later. But if you read much about history, it seems like that sort of trend is common. People often end the slave trade first, and then later they try to end slavery within the country. The British Empire chose to buy out the slaves from some aristocrats, but I think the U.S. during Jefferson's time was quite poor and probably didn't have the money to do it. We were paying roughly a quarter to a third of our budget to Northern Africa to keep people over there from enslaving Americans. All people have an ability to do good or bad things, and that it's a decision. Whereas most collectivists believe that ideology comes first. And if you just get rid of a particular ideology, somehow bad things will stop happening. And, a lot of socialists, including especially the modern democratic socialists, seem to think, well, if we just get rid of this or that ideology, if we could just get rid of capitalism, people will stop being greedy. Okay, well, that just isn't the case. Unfortunately, things like greed and so on are tend to be human traits, and human beings have to make a decision to not follow those sorts of ideologies. But on the upside, things like empathy and caring for other people are also human traits. So you want to emphasize the good ones over the bad ones. These ellipses separate entire days in Columbus's journals and ignore passages that prove Columbus was respectful of the indigenous tribes. Indeed, in one such Zinn ignored passage, Columbus tells his men to take nothing from the natives without offering something in exchange. In another, he sympathetically notes that the Taínos had wounds on their bodies from battles with other tribes who had sought to enslave them. In yet another, the very first comment Columbus makes about the Caribbean natives, he declares his desire to make them friends with the Taíno and have them be made free and converted to Christianity. Obviously, modern audiences are not going to like the fact that he wanted to convert everyone to Christianity, but I think that given some of the other sources I've provided so far through this video, it presents a little bit different narrative than what they're teaching in humanities college courses today. Columbus was not quite the villain that he's been made out to be. Okay. Another thing I'd like to point out, just in closing this video, Columbus Day was not brought about to support any sort of white supremacy in the Western world. It was actually created as a counter to white supremacy. As you can see on your screen now, in fact, Columbus Day was created by President Harris in 1892 in response to the anti-Italian motivated lynching of 11 Italian Americans in New Orleans in 1891. Okay. This is a sort of racism that Italians and Irish Catholics were facing during that time period from the Ku Klux Klan. Ku Klux Klan did not like Catholics. They came back again in the 1920s and tried to make Catholic schools illegal in Oregon and Washington State. Fortunately, they failed, and Americans, by and large, have always rejected the garbage that is the KKK. But, these communists consistently want to present America as something else other than a nation of people that has fought for liberty with increasingly larger and larger groups of people, and largely by supporting the primacy of the individual and that belief in intrinsic value. Okay, so if you have any questions or you'd like to add something else, feel free to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear what you have to say.